Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Do you ever feel like you don't measure up to the other women around you? Perhaps you've decided to wait on pursuing a particular goal or dream until you reach a specific weight loss goal. Or maybe you've been struggling with shame about something that happened in the past, and you feel like that has disqualified you from leadership or ministry. Hey friend, I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and if you resonate with any of this, or if you work with women in any capacity, this episode is for you. Today, Holly and I are chatting with our guest, Rachael Gilbert. Rachael was actually a guest on our podcast way back in episode 14 at the beginning of the show, and she is back with us again today. So I'm really excited for you to get to listen to this conversation. I know you are going to get so much out of what we talk about. We cover a lot of ground in this episode, including how your core beliefs are connected to confidence, what body image and the fruit of the Spirit have to do with each other, and we talk about big T versus little t trauma. We also discuss whether trauma can or should disqualify us from leadership and why it's so important to address the hurt in our hearts when it happens. All right, before we dive in, I want to mention that today's episode is sponsored by Confident Conversations mini course. This is a mini course I created to help you initiate and lead hard conversations. Even if you struggle with confrontation, you aren't sure what to say, and you want to avoid hurting people in the process. This mini course will help you resolve conflict biblically, build healthier relationships, and create transformation in your workplace, ministry, home, or wherever you relate to others. So check out the details for this mini course at confidentconversations.co. That's confidentconversations.co. The link will be in the show notes for this episode as well. Now let's dive into our conversation with Rachael Gilbert. All right. Well, Rachael, I am super excited to have you with us today. And you actually were a guest on our podcast way back in 2018, one of our very first guests. So it's fun to have you back. Welcome to the show.
Esther, thank you for having me back. And I love reflecting on when I was a guest on your show, because people don't always know this, but when I started my podcast, I had never been a guest before. And I know that's kind of weird. Like,
right.
I don't know that I'd recommend that to a friend, but that's just the way it was. I'd never been invited on to be a guest. And I think your podcast was one of the first ones I was a guest on. So hopefully I did a good job. I don't know. I don't remember.
I'm sure you did. And we'll put the link to that first episode in the show notes of this one. So we're going to kind of skip over the full backstory. We always start off by asking you to share a little bit about yourself and your current leadership, and then we dive into your leadership journey. So if anybody wants to hear your past leadership journey, go back and listen to that episode. We'll put it in the show notes. But why don't you just tell us right now what your life and leadership looks like so our listeners can know a little more about you?
Leadership is so fun because I feel like just when we think we've figured it out, we go and we take a new level, or God calls us to something new, and we're like, oh man, I got to be uncomfortable again. I was just getting comfortable. And a mentor of mine once told me discomfort is the price of admission to taking new territory. And I remind myself of that often because I'm like, all right, I'm uncomfortable. This is a good sign as a leader. I'm being stretched. So since we've last spoken, a lot has changed. I now am practicing as a licensed counselor. My husband and I own a business, BBC Health. And in the midst of just the things that we run behind the scenes, my husband, he used to practice in the clinic, but now he runs it as the CEO of it. And I am releasing my first book, have my podcast, and then we also have 3 kids. And so we are in the season of lots of things, but learning how to be good leaders, even when we have a lot on our plate. That's been something that has really been growing both of us lately, kind of dealing with that burnout personally, but then having to stop and deal with it so that it doesn't spew out on the people that we're leading.
That goes right into a topic we were already talking about this morning. We already recorded an episode. We talk about the pressures of a female leader. So you're like right on par with where we're at today. So since you were here in 2018, which feels like it was just yesterday, but if I'm doing my math correctly, that's 5 years ago. You went back to school and became a counselor. So I'd love for you to tell us, first of all, why you wanted to do that, but maybe about the journey of becoming a counselor and what you've learned about leadership since we last talked to you.
Holly, I love this question because this is one of those pivots in the road that I honestly didn't see coming. In fact, as far as I was concerned, last time we spoke, I was running fast and furious in a certain direction and having a good time with it. And then the Lord kind of hit the brakes with me. And I won't share that whole story of how I ended up going back to school, but just felt called to go back and get my master's. And when he asked me to do that, that meant I had to actually step back. And it felt like I was losing that territory. I felt like, oh man, I was making all this progress. Things were blowing and going. I was growing and people are asking me to do things. And I had to go tell a whole bunch of people no. And not only just once did I have to say no, for the 3 years that I was in school, I had to say no more times than I would like to even ever say no my whole life, which was hard for me for multiple reasons. One, I don't like to say no to people. I've learned how to now. But 2, they were fun opportunities. They were opportunities that most people would have loved to have, but I just knew God was asking me to take a pause in my journey and to go back to school. And I'm so grateful I did. I do love being a therapist, but I will just say, even going through the training to become a counselor, I got so much freedom for myself I didn't know I needed, especially as a leader. I essentially learned I had like no emotional intelligence. And, I learned that about myself becoming a counselor. I'm like, oh my, I don't process emotions at all. And just learned all kinds of stuff that has helped me, even if I had decided not to go into private practice and become a counselor, just going through that training helped me to stop and deal with some stuff from my past. And even just in the way that I functioned, it really did. It forced me to stop and deal with these things. And I have thanked the Lord so many times that he put that pause on my journey to have me deal with some things. Especially I dealt with some things before I wrote a book, because I cringe to think if I had written a book before I went and did that inner healing work, right? I would have spewed a lot of my unprocessed pain into the pages of that book. And so that's kind of a very condensed version of what you asked, why did you do that? And I just know that I couldn't explain it at the time. And it even seemed crazy to me because I had been a stay-at-home mom for a decade. And I'm like, hey, we're going back to school. I was doing schoolwork alongside my kids. And I'm just so grateful. While I couldn't explain it at the time, now I already see it was the grace of God that asked me to go pivot and go study and get that degree.
Yeah. I love 2 things that you just shared, Rachel. One is this idea of a pause in your journey. For so many of us, when something like this happens, where God calls us to do something that maybe we weren't planning on doing, like going back to school, we think it's like this major upheaval or major pivot that's never going to, our life's never going to look the same. And for you, I love that phrase that you just used, like it was a pause, like certain things you had to say no to, certain things you had to give up for a season. but it didn't mean it was forever. So I think that's an amazing leadership lesson right there for our listeners to absorb. And then the other idea is just this idea of so many times when God asks us to do something and we think we're doing it for the sake of other people, but then it actually blesses us. And I would say like this podcast for me has been one of those things. Like I thought I was starting this podcast to help other leaders, which hopefully this does. But I have been blessed so many times by the conversations I've been able to have. And so it sounds like just going back to school and that journey of healing for yourself, like you said, even if you didn't end up using that degree to help others, it still helped you along the way. So I just think that's beautiful. So you have written a book called Image Restored, Tear Down Shame and Insecurity to Experience a Body Image Renovation. And that sounds like something that a lot of us could use. So we're going to dive into this idea a little bit around body image and around shame and insecurity and all of that. But I'd love to just start by hearing, why did you write this book? What led you to share this message with your readers?
As a leader, I remember whenever I was sitting in a leadership class, I think I did briefly share about this when I was on in 2018. So I won't tell the whole story because I don't want listeners to have to double hear a story. But that class was called WILD, which is Women in Leadership Development. And an author came in to speak. And at first I thought, well, this doesn't apply to me because I wasn't a writer, didn't consider myself a writer. And she made a comment, though. She said, if you want to be a leader, you need to at least know how to write because you'll be called upon to submit a devotion or be able to write something. And so she said, you just should work on your writing. And that's why I started a blog to work on my writing. And that's really how I kind of got into all the things that I'm doing. And I knew as I started to write, I just felt like God put it on my heart. I want to write a book. And really, I want to write several books. And so back when we spoke, 2018, the book I was really wanting to write was something on, like I said, being bold, getting out there, going after your dreams. And I'm still for that message. Maybe one day God will let me write that exciting, bright, and colorful message. But in going back to school and in doing my own work, I realized, as I started to process, I started to really recognize and put the pieces of the puzzle together of how much body image. And one of the reasons the book actually doesn't say body image restored, it's image restored, is because body image is just one more layer of image. It's that whole fear of man. And I'm saying mankind, obviously men and women when I say man. But as I did my own work, I realized, oh man, this underlying fear of what people are thinking of me, trying to keep up some sort of image, whether it's in my body, my business, my social media platform, my house, my kids, all the things, it had consumed my life up until that point. And I was sick of it. I'm like, you know what? If I'm going to be a leader, I've got to address this in myself. And so I did. I spent a couple of years doing some deep work, really, really going through that. But then the message that God really wanted me to write was on body image because when I was in school, my internship was at an eating disorder center. And that was a main specialty of mine and still is. And so all the pieces of the puzzle just started to come together as I look back on my own body image journey and then the things that I was counseling people. And then even as a fitness instructor, all the pieces of the puzzle came together. And it's actually crazy. When I sat down to write the book, I actually wrote the book in 3 months, which is kind of unheard of. I wouldn't recommend that to a friend either. When you're up against a deadline, it's kind of amazing what you're able to do. However, it was the message that was already just in me. So it just needed to come up and out. And that's the other beauty of following God's timing as a leader is he's depositing all these things in us along the way. And when the time is there that he says, okay, now's the time to release, it just kind of comes up and out. And you're like, oh, wow, okay, this is already all there. I just have to package it in a way that makes sense for people.
I so agree with you. And I think that it's so interesting that you just said that last thought that way, that, God is sort of depositing these things in you, because I think we want to rush it so many times. Like, God just gave me this one little tidbit and I want to share it with everyone. And sometimes he calls us to do that, but then sometimes he calls us to sit and wait and to kind of really internalize it and really get it in our system, I guess you would say, before we really get it out into the world. And have a message to share, a fully formed message to share. So thank you for talking about that, because I think so often we just want to push forward and, we have this great thing that we want to talk about, and we really need to be sensitive and discerning to how the Holy Spirit wants us to share those things. So on this podcast, one of our goals is to help women lead with confidence. And for many women, they struggle with confidence if they don't feel really great about their bodies. So could you share how you believe confidence and body image are connected?
Well, the first thing that was coming to my mind when we talk about that word confidence is, and I do mention this in my book, but I also just believe this across the board, is that we all are walking around with core beliefs. So whenever you're talking about core beliefs, the word confidence and core belief kind of come together. And when we see that we're not having confidence, I always want to go back and look at, okay, what core beliefs do we have that we have attached our confidence to? So back to the body image thing, for many people, men and women alike, by the way, this thing is a male thing. Also, my book is written in the voice for a female, but for now we're addressing it from that female perspective. But when we look at it from body image perspective, it often comes back to an identity thing, or there is obviously definitely can be other things like unresolved trauma and unprocessed emotions, which I did address that as well in the book. But as far as confidence in a core belief is looking at, okay, where in my life, could have been childhood, it could have been anywhere along the way, have I believed some kind of a core belief that in order to be a confident woman, confident man, confident person, I have to look a certain way. And look at our culture. Yeah, you're getting that message everywhere you turn. There are unspoken messages. Nobody's saying that. I mean, maybe sometimes they are, but even the ads are selling us these things that, hey, look at this. If you look like this on the outside, then you'll be able to stand up nice and tall, and you'll be able to march confidently onto that stage and feeling pride in what you've accomplished and all of this. And so whether you receive that message from culture, from growing up, from wherever, somewhere along the way, if we're not careful, we can marry our confidence in what does the outside of me look like? What are people saying when they see me? And we know this goes more than just body image. It goes, how much money do I make? And how many followers do I have? And which neighborhood do I live in? And what's my job? Like, this can apply to so many areas, but especially body image as female leaders. Yeah, we definitely have to be mindful that we're not following a line of thinking that makes us believe like, oh man, if I don't look like this person, then I guess I have nothing to offer. And that's just a lie.
Yeah. One of the things that I have seen, and I've heard women talk about this too, is this idea of like kind of holding back and not doing things until they achieve a particular, outward appearance that they are trying to do. But you talk about, in your book, mentions this idea of reframing our views and our thoughts and gaining this biblical perspective on confidence. So you alluded to it just now, but I'm wondering if you could dive a little deeper into that, in like whether from a counselor perspective or just a faith perspective, what are some of the ways that maybe we can change our thinking around that and not have to hold back on what God might be asking us to do?
Esther, that's a great question, because especially from that faith perspective, we know that Jesus often taught and spoke on, what are we building our life on? Is it on solid foundation of his truth, or is it on sinking sand? And essentially anything that we're trying to get contentment or confidence from that is not built on the solid rock of Jesus is always going to disappoint us. Even if you achieve it, that's actually the most disappointing piece. Timothy Keller has a great quote on this that he said, idols consume us, they disappoint us, and then they devastate us. So they consume us when we're going, oh man, if I just could, like he said, once I lose that weight, or once I hit that particular goal, whatever it is, oh, then everything's going to come together. And then you get it and you're disappointed because you're like, oh, everything didn't come together. Oh no, because we're putting our hope and our faith and our trust in something that is shifting. It's sinking sand. It is not eternal. It's not the word of God. And so we will always be disappointed when our hope is in those things. Is it great to have goals? Absolutely. I always like to be clear. I'm never saying don't have goals and don't, like those are great things to have, things that you'd like to do and like to achieve. But our hope better not be in that thing. And our confidence better not be coming from if that thing happens. Because even when that thing happens, you're going to be let down to realize, oh man, even Solomon talked about that in Ecclesiastes. Like, I had everything. I achieved everything. I had more than anybody could ever ask for. And it wasn't enough.
Yeah, I love that view of it, because I think that so often when we try to achieve something like overcoming these struggles, we're like, why isn't it working? What's wrong with me? And we are forgetting. It's almost like we don't have the perspective to realize what you're saying about these idols, that when we are worshiping these things that we feel like we need to overcome, it's actually, like you said, consuming us and breaking us. And we feel like because this is a positive thing that we're doing, losing weight or working out or whatever positive thing we're doing, that it's innately good and that it's not destroying us. And that's a huge lie that we've all believed. And so I think it's just really important, like you said, to just check where our heart is on the subject, where our hope is placed. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I think it's super important. So as we're talking about this, lots of us have struggled with body image issues, and we've tried lots of things to change it. And I think this kind of comes back to just what you were talking about. So I'm not sure if this is the same thing or if you can dive even deeper in this, but why do you think we struggle to overcome these issues? Is it just that perspective, or is there something else we're missing?
Well, I do have to say it is a little different for every person, because as a counselor, I do always want to mention that, especially trauma, in fact, in most eating disorders, in most addictions, the root almost always almost always is some trauma that has not been dealt with, and it expresses itself. So that is something that makes me a little unique in the way that I wrote my book from other things I've seen out there, is I do recognize that. And I always like to tell people, if you feel really stuck and if you feel like just shifting perspective and taking thoughts captive and prayer and talking to friends and getting in the word isn't shifting, then that's the time that I would say you need to go talk to a counselor. That would be my recommendation. I advocate. I am a counselor. I have my own counselor. I'm a big fan. And so I do always have to just address that head on right there and just say that to people of, if you're stuck and you feel like you've been stuck, go talk to somebody. It's time to maybe deal with some things and just be also encouraged. That's also the Lord's kindness, taking you to that new level in your own personal freedom and journey and what you need next, especially as a leader too. So there's that little side thing that I definitely would say that's a big one that comes to mind for me as we're talking about this, because sometimes these things can be resolved simply by reframing the way we're thinking and, doing some work that's not super deep, but is awareness and is good mental health practice skills. But then there's other times where we do just need to stop and actually address it on a much deeper level. And so that's the first thing that does come to mind. Do you have any other follow-up questions on that or anything else? I thought something else came to mind, but I think it left.
Well, I have something that I don't know if it's directly connected to this, but I'm thinking, like, we've had conversations about some of these topics on the podcast before. And I'm even just thinking about my own life and people that I know that are like, maybe I want to be exercising more regularly. So I'm, setting a goal and I'm tracking and maybe I have a weight goal and all of these things. But like, it can get to a point for some of us where it's a bit obsessive, where we start to get really mad if we miss a day, or if the number on the scale isn't moving in the right direction, we get upset or things like that. And so I guess, how do we know what is a healthy way of approaching some of these topics like exercise and healthy eating and those types of things versus when maybe we do need to reach out to a counselor for help or, do something different outside of just our own management of our exercise and our weight loss and things like that?
Esther, this is such a great question. And it actually jogged my memory on what I was going to say. Also, I feel like is a missing piece. When it comes to the body, people are very private. And so we have not talked much about body image. You don't hear it talked much, definitely not in churches or even most of the podcasts that I'm going on. They're like, well, we've never done this topic before. So not only publicly do we not speak about this stuff much, but then one-on-one conversations, even when we do go to dinner with friends, if we talk anything body related, it's which diet are you on? We don't really let each other into these struggles. And I did share a little bit about that, I think in the introduction of my book, about just how for years it was a personal struggle all by myself. Even my own husband for years didn't know I was struggling. And so the more we start talking about these things with each other and making it more the norm, because here's the thing that breaks my heart and what I want to see shift is the leaders who do speak about this stuff, most of them aren't coming at it from a biblical perspective. And so the things we are hearing talked about are kind of back to your question just now, behaviors that are actually quite disordered at the root of it, and mindsets that are quite extreme and quite obsessive that are not healthy and are not God's best for us. And so that's why I love as leaders that we are stepping up and we're talking about this, because it then helps one, hopefully other leaders start talking about it amongst themselves, but then even with their own people, their own friends, so that we can have these safe places where, yes, to your point, sometimes if you notice it's getting really extreme and really obsessive, it might be time to see a counselor. But other times, if we just had a really great community that I could come in and be like, hey, Esther, I just have to be honest with you. I started on this healthy eating thing and I'm a couple months in and I'm not sure. I feel like I'm kind of going over into a place that it's not healthy anymore. And then if you were in my space, you could go, actually, yeah, I have noticed, like you've turned us down for dinner for several times. Is there a reason for that? And I could, actually, I had already met my calorie count for the day. So I decided not to go to dinner that night, which is a disordered eating behavior that happens, that we'll avoid places just because we're counting calories so tightly. And so that's the beauty of great community too, that sometimes, yes, we need a counselor and sometimes we just need really great community who we can kind of hold each other accountable. And then to answer your question also, sorry, I'm answering it in like 3 different directions here about how can we know if a behavior is healthy or not? Because you're right. Moving our body, that was God's idea. Like fitness industry, scooch over, because God was the one who designed us to move. Our fingers and our joints in our body, they move. Like that's God's design that we move. We have twisted it into this thing that's heavy and hard and awkward and shame-filled, and we need to take that back. Food was also God's idea, and he meant for it to be a gift and a friend, not an enemy, or to be like placing morals on ourselves. If I've been very bad today because I ate something, wait, what? Our morals are now rising and falling on food? And my character, wait, what? That's craziness. And so I know that whenever these good things that were God's idea turn and get twisted is usually when we see the fruits of the Spirit leave. And so to your point, if you're noticing like, oh man, this is like, I'm kind of getting a little obsessive. Well, are any of the fruits of the Spirit still available? Do we still have love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness to ourselves, even, self-control, all these things. And if I notice that I'm doing some form of exercise or type of eating, that there's no joy, there's no peace, I am mean to myself when I can't follow it. Well, there's no fruits of the Spirit there. And that's when I know, ooh, something's off. And I need to take a step back and get with the Lord and see what the next step is to make sure I'm in alignment with him.
Oh, my word. I love that. I think that's so powerful. I don't want to say easy, but such a great way of figuring out whether something's healthy or unhealthy. And I think that's so powerful. to be able to just ask myself, are the fruits of the Spirit present in this? And I'm just, that's such a quick and like such a gold nugget, I guess, that you just handed our listeners. So thank you for that. I'm going to circle back to something that you've mentioned a couple of times, and it's actually something that you teach in the book. You talk about tools for overcoming comparison and trauma, and we've mentioned those two things along the way. But I'm hoping that first you can share with us what you think comparison and trauma have stolen from us individually, but also have stolen from the body of Christ.
Ooh, that's a great question. Let's start with comparison, because they are a little different. Comparison, absolutely. I mean, it steals all the fruits of the Spirit. Let's go back to that. I mean, you're right. It is. I think when the Lord taught me that about several areas of my life, it's pretty eye-opening, because comparison never brings fruit into our lives, into the lives of those around us. In fact, it just robs us of peace and joy and relationship and all the things. Like, we could go into that for quite some time. Something that the Lord taught me, and I did introduce this principle in the book, but I'll just tell it to all y'all right now. You don't even need the book to learn this principle. Is I call it yardsticking. And so if you can imagine a yardstick that measures something, right? We use those to measure things. And if we think about a yardstick, let's say that, Holly, I'm a visual person, and you and I were friends, and I was always comparing myself to you in different areas. And so that would be like me having an imaginary yardstick between you and me. And have you ever had a friend or somebody in your life that you're like, I really like this person, but I can't quite get close to them for some reason. I don't know why. Like, it's almost like there's something between us. Well, sometimes that something between us might be a comparison yardstick of I'm constantly subconsciously, because I think most of us aren't consciously comparing. And if we were, we'll stop it usually, but I'm subconsciously comparing myself to Holly. And so when I notice that I'm doing that, then of course we want to break the yardstick. I don't want to just set it down. I want to demolish it. And so there's 3 R's that I teach to demolish a comparison yardstick. The first one is to recognize, which that's the first thing I just did with you right there. I recognized, oh, that's what's between me and Holly. I'm comparing myself to her. That's why we can't get close, because I have this thing in between us. So I recognized it. The second thing I have to do is repent. And that's between me and the Lord. And then sometimes to the friend, I have awkwardly repented to somebody for being jealous of them. And it was the most awkward conversation maybe of my life. But I can tell you that me and this woman now, we're actually really close, because it broke that yardstick. I was like, I have an awkward thing to tell you. So we repent, and, repent to the Lord for that, for being jealous of my friend and for wanting what somebody else has. And then the third R, though, it's probably one of the hardest, but also one of the most liberating, and it's rejoice. And we rejoice over that person we were comparing to. So with Holly, I would say, and this is between me and the Lord, or however I felt led to do it, but I would just pray over you and bless you. Like, Lord, I thank you so much for Holly, how you have gifted her in this way, and how she's so, basically the things I was sitting around being jealous of you for, I would rejoice over that. I would ask the Lord to enlarge your territory even more. If it was because of something you have done, or, a book you wrote that I was like, oh man, I would have liked to write that book. I'll go and share your book with all my friends and say, you guys need to go buy Holly's book. And when we do this, it breaks something off in our heart for sure. It also breaks down that comparison yardstick. And then it literally just kicks the enemy in the face and knocks out all his teeth. Because here he was trying to bring division, and it was working for a little bit. And then we said, no, not only are you not going to divide me anymore with this person in my life, but I'm going to turn around and I'm going to bless them. And it's really fun to do. It's hard at first, but the more I do it, it becomes even more fun.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, can you circle back to the trauma piece? Could you share with us what your thoughts are about how trauma is impacting us individually and as the body of Christ?
Yeah, so I specialized in trauma, and I am trained in EMDR. I don't know if anybody is familiar with that, but that's my primary modality in treating trauma in private practice. And let's condense this for a little bit. First of all, I know every human being is walking around with unprocessed trauma. And I know trauma is a hard word. It's getting used a lot more. And I even was recently talking with another therapist that I had on my podcast, and we were just saying, I think sometimes it's the phrase trauma that people go, they're not really even sure what it means. And so to put things extremely simply, there's such things as big T traumas, which I think most people know about big T traumas. But the small T traumas are the ones that kind of go a little more undetected. And those are the things that have happened recurring over your life that's in the same theme, the same message. And it's kind of like stacking little stones on top of each other. And if it started in the third grade of somebody called you a name, or you felt stupid when you raised your hand and got the question wrong, those are what we call small T traumas because they stack up over time. And then you'll realize 20 years later, why am I stuck in this area? I can't figure this out. Like I've tried all the things and I'm stuck. And a lot of times it's because we have some unresolved traumas that just, if we can go back to the root of where those even began, we can make all those stones that have stacked up over the years just demolish and go away. And that's probably my favorite part of working with trauma is those aha moments where you're like, oh my goodness, there's that theme and there it is. And we get to address it and tear it down. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful thing to do. How it's affecting us, though, is that trauma, and again, we could do a whole episode on this. So I don't know how deep you guys want me to go into this. You're like, oh my, we opened a whole, you took the lid off of something here. But I'm trying to give just some tidbits of how it shows up. Trauma shows up in everybody in a little bit different ways, depending on what type of trauma it was. But here's what we know at the end of the day. If you feel like you have any unresolved trauma, unresolved emotions around that trauma, as a leader, one of the best gifts you can give to yourself and to everybody around you is to take some time, again, do that pause button if you need to, and deal with it, because it will leak out in ways that you wish it wouldn't have. And that's why we see leaders do things that everybody goes, whoa, where'd that come from? And it's almost always something that, man, if we could have just stopped and addressed some things that were expressing themselves in behaviors or way they deal with things and whatnot, it didn't need to turn out the way that it did. So I'm happy to answer any other questions you have about trauma. But like I said, I don't want to spend the next 20 minutes going off on a tangent about it.
Well, I think you're right. I think this could be an entirely separate episode. And I think there's like 4 directions I want to go with my follow-up question. So I'm going to try to pick one. But I really am curious your thoughts on, like you said, this word is becoming so common. In fact, I saw a post and I wish I could remember what it said precisely the other day, but it was like somebody defining what trauma is. And I was like, if that's trauma, then we're all having trauma all day long. Like, I think it was essentially like trauma is any unprocessed emotion. And I was like, like, so if I'm just driving down the street and like I honk my horn at somebody and like something happens and then I don't process that, does that mean I just had trauma? And also I have a teenage daughter. So of course, this is a topic, right? Because this younger generation is hearing all about trauma all the time. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, how do we sort of discern what is trauma, even that little T trauma, versus what is just normal life? Like, and maybe some stuff isn't trauma that needs to be dealt with, like in the way that you were saying, like we actually need to unpack it and deal with it, versus what is just like normal life. Or maybe normal life is dealing out trauma all day long. I don't know. And that could be opening a can of worms too. So
Yeah, for sure. This is such a great question because you're right. It is getting thrown around a lot. And the biggest thing that I would say about the day-to-day things that you're mentioning, because I'm trying to remember the phrase he gave it. John Eldredge, I love his work. And he wrote a book called Resilience. And he talked about how even 2020, everything we went through, that was trauma for everybody. But he had a different type of word for it. It was something about like something when you go through something as a group. And anyhow, all that to say, you bring up a great point that we all do experience distressing life events daily. The question is, what do we do with them? Which is why I'm such an advocate for dealing with things in the here and the now and having hard conversations. And so let's use that example you gave. Somebody cut me off, like, that was distressing. Okay. If I was able to honestly just be like, that was frustrating. Okay. Take some deep breaths and I'm over it. That's probably not going to be something that's going to show up in my life 10 years from now. Okay. The ones that we worry about are the things like when I was let's just use it here and the now. I'm not even going to use a third grade. Just today, I'm going to give you an example. I'm not going to tell you what was said. Somebody said something to me that hurt my feelings, like honestly was a attack on my character, if you will. And I have not had a chance to process it yet. Here we are talking. So the tempting thing for me to do would be at the end of my day today, be like, let's go ahead and just numb that and pretend it didn't happen. Because especially as leaders, we can go into overwork mode, and our go-to can sometimes be, you can go a couple different ways, but can be, it's fine. Like, it's fine, whatever, just let it roll off my shoulders. When it really didn't roll off your shoulders, when it really actually like, yeah, I'm going to need to process that. Like, so the thing that was said to me earlier today, later tonight or tomorrow or something, I'm going to need to take space to process it. And if I don't, you better believe that that little T trauma is going to show up, maybe not next week, maybe not even next year, but it's going to stack up and it's going to cause me to operate from a place of hurt, a place of offense, right? Because that's essentially, I was offended. I was hurt. And so those are the pieces that are critical, like that we have to become, it's that self-awareness piece where we have to, because I can't tell you the number of people, even in counseling, I've noticed this, that they say, oh, it's fine though. I've forgiven them and stuff. Okay, that's fine if you've forgiven them, but are you really over it? Because we're still talking about it. Like, you brought it up at least 5 different times in different ways, different sessions. So even if you have forgiven whoever did the offending, have you honestly dealt with the hurt that it left on your heart? And that's the thing only we can answer. Because then there's been other times where I've seen somebody go through something that I'm like, and you're okay? Like, we can't even understand it, but they dealt with it and it's not still a thing in their heart. And so we are the only ones who can honestly reflect and go, ooh, that did hurt. And then to stack on top of this, we also live a bit in a culture that tells us, well, that shouldn't have hurt your feelings. That was silly that hurt your feelings. Okay, we have to stop judging our feelings. It hurt your heart. And if that hurt came up, let's don't judge it. Let's just recognize it for what it is and go, yeah, that thing hurt my feelings and I need to address that. So that's the little T traumas that show up all over the place that, yeah, you're right, Esther. We don't need to sit around. We wouldn't get anything done in our lives if we were sitting around dealing with all the things that were distressing. But so there are some things that it's like, yeah, that was distressing, but it didn't alter my identity. It didn't alter what I believe about myself or what I believe about the world or what I believe about other people. It was just an annoyance. That's the difference.
That's really helpful. Thank you for sharing that perspective.
Okay, so I think I have one more follow-up to these trauma questions and then we can switch gears. But as leaders, I think it's important, like you said, to have self-awareness. And I believe we've talked about this before, but I would love to hear your perspective on how do we know as a leader when our trauma is unhealthy for others, and or we could say this different way, when does it disqualify us for leadership? Because, in the church, we talk about redemption and, everything can be redeemed. And even people who had moral failures and those sorts of things, like our goal is to restore, right? But when does that trauma disqualify us from leading in such a way that we would actually cause greater harm to others because we're still either living in that trauma or we're an open wound or, the wound is infected? Can you talk to us about that so that we can have that self-awareness?
That is a great question, Holly, and actually might be one of the best questions I've heard in around trauma of when does it disqualify us as a leader? That's excellent. Of course, I always have to start with it is different for every individual. So I can't just sit here and say one blanket statement for everybody in existence for sure. The most unhealthy trauma is the one that is ignored or numbed or act like it doesn't exist. I am more concerned about that kind of trauma than I am about somebody who is aware that they have some trauma and they're getting help around it. They have wisdom speaking into their life. So not only from a counselor, but also from, whatever their position would be, whether it be elders or a board or trusted counsel or somebody who is aware of it also. And so when a leader is aware that they have some trauma, that they're processing trauma, then they're not disqualified because again, we've all got, I feel like every time I think I've processed all the trauma in my life, I'm like, oh, and there comes some more. That's awesome. I'm like, okay. So if we're going to sit around and wait for all of our trauma to be processed, to be leaders, have fun waiting for that because that won't, we're going to constantly be, as we know, the Lord healing comes in layers and the further along we go, new things come up. I know for me, taking new territory and becoming an author, new stuff has come up. New insecurities that I didn't even know were in my heart have come up and new things that God's saying, oh, time to process that one. But the difference in it is when it comes up, I try my very best not to just ignore it, not to dismiss it, not to say, oh, well, this isn't a big deal and everybody deals with this. Maybe that is true that everybody deals with it, but I am stopping and addressing it when it comes up and putting boundaries in place and being honest with the people who are in my inner circle and saying, hey, I'm going through this right now. I need y'all to know this. Pray for me in this way. And then getting the help that I need. So that's my own personal opinion is that, yeah, we're always going to have things that we're processing, but is it submitted is the question. Or are we just saying, I am perfect. I have no problems. There's no fault in me. That's the type that we have to worry about because there's no self-awareness piece at all or any type of taking responsibility or ownership, especially if we see that trauma come out and we hurt somebody that we're leading by something we say, being able to go back and apologize to them shows a humble leader going, I am so sorry that I responded to you that way. I just need you to know that was not about you. That was about something that was happening in my heart. And I apologize and I take responsibility for that. Will you please forgive me? And to me, that's a sign of a healthy leader that when it comes out and we spew something that we didn't even know was in our heart, that we'll take responsibility for it.
So good, Rachel. I love this conversation. I know we could just keep going and going, but we're gonna wrap up. But I guess I would love to just hear if there's any final words that you would have for a woman who is struggling with this issue, struggling with body image or confidence or, maybe shame over things in the past that you would want to share as an encouragement for her.
The thing that's coming to my mind right now, and it kind of circles back on what Holly, how she just phrased that last question of being disqualified. And I just want to say to every woman here that wherever you are on your journey of body image, confidence, shame, insecurity, trauma, all those things, it does not disqualify you from being a leader. Just know that we are all works in progress and it's part of your journey. That's why I call these things journeys. I'm still on my journey. And the key is that we keep going on the journey together and we keep getting up and trying again and taking ownership for our mistakes and our things that we don't get quite right. But you are not disqualified, and do not let the enemy lead you to believe that until you pull yourself together, then you could lead. No. In fact, people aren't drawn to those kinds of leaders that appear to have everything together. They want to know that you're in the trenches with them and that you're willing to work out the hard things with them.
It's really powerful. And I think that's going to benefit a lot of our listeners. So thank you for giving that word of encouragement. I think as we kind of bring this back to leadership, we really believe that leaders are learners on this podcast. We talk about it all the time. And we know that usually our guests have really great resources that they are learning from. So I was wondering if you had a book or a podcast or any other resource that you've been learning from recently that you would like to share with our listeners.
2 books that come to mind. The Emotionally Healthy Woman is one. I cannot think of the author's name off the top of my head, so maybe y'all know that or can put it in there. And then another book that comes to mind it's called In Our Lives First. It's by Diane Langberg, and it's written not just for counselors, but for anybody in the helping field, profession. And I feel like a leader falls under that. But I love it because it's talking about how you got to take care of yourself first if you want to go help other people. And there's 2 editions of it. I really love the first one, especially, but it's a very simple, quick little 1 to 2 page things that I've gleaned a lot from. And I feel like every leader definitely could.
Awesome. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, we'll put the links for those and make sure the authors are in there as well. And what's really interesting about this whole conversation, it's funny, like, your book is centered around body image and around the way we view ourselves, but I feel like it's a part of a bigger conversation about becoming emotionally healthy and spiritually healthy, right? And getting our views around who we are lining up with how God sees us. So I think those recommendations are so helpful because we all need to be growing and on that journey together so we can be better leaders. So love it. So Rachel, thank you so much for sharing with us today. And I know that the ladies that are listening are going to want to connect with you and maybe go grab your book or find out more about what you have to offer. So could you just share the best ways for people to connect with you?
Yes, the book page is imagerestoredbook.com. And then my main hub is my name, RachelGilbert.com. You do spell Rachel a little different with an extra A, Rachael. And then for fun, I hang out on Instagram, Rachael J. Gilbert there. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for joining us on the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, would you consider leaving us a rating and review in your podcast app? This helps more women just like you find the podcast, and it also helps them to know whether the podcast would be a good fit for them. Just go to the show in your podcast app, then scroll down until you see the option for ratings and reviews. From there, you can tap to rate and write a review. It means the world to us when you take a couple minutes to do this, and thank you so much to everyone who has left a review. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.